Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. My guest on Bluegrass Jam Along this week is Ethan Sherman, and Ethan's here to talk about a couple of things. He has a new record out called Passages, which I've listened to for the last couple of weeks and absolutely loving. And we're also going to have a chat about a book that he's co-authored, and we'll get onto that in a bit. But Ethan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this one. I've been listening to the record for the past couple of weeks, and you sent it over. The record's called Passages, and it's essentially it's sort of bluegrass instrumentals, isn't it? And I love instrumental string band music that is kind of not just the fiddle tunes we all know and love, but the stuff that sits in that space, sort of maybe somewhere slightly between improvised and composed, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
And this sort of fits in there. And I maybe to start, it'd be interesting to talk about, because this record took a while to make in the end, didn't it?
Yeah. There were a couple false starts.
So I believe you were about to go into the studio and then you got COVID, which sort of slowed it down, but then you got offered a gig, which took you away for a year and a half.
Yeah, that's basically the short story. If we zoom back even further to like 2020, I had been wanting to do some kind of project in this vein really since then. At the beginning of 2020, I was like, okay, this is my time to finally do something like this. And then we all know what happened in 2020. So I thought, well, let me just, write some tunes and maybe make some demos and so that I have something. And then that ended up turning into a record of its own, that I put out in, I guess, 2022 called Indoor Vistas. So this new thing, it was, I sort of thought of it as a continuation of that idea a little bit. Like, okay, that was the kind of remote surrealist version. Now I want to, do this for real, in a room with people and really celebrate everything that you can do when you're actually in a room making music with people in real time, as opposed to sculpting it together piece by piece. So yeah, I started thinking about it kind of around the time that Indoor Vistas record came out, which was 2-ish years ago. And yeah, we were gonna, it was probably gonna look completely different. The tunes were going to be completely different. There were tunes that were going to be in that initial session that I ended up canning. The band was going to be slightly different. We were going to have less time to record. All in all, it was going to be kind of a rush job, just because of, time and budget and things like that. So having to cancel the session was kind of a blessing in disguise. And then that afforded me a lot more time and space to think about how I wanted to do it a little more and just be a little more intentional about it. And part of that was originally I was going to produce it myself. And then I ended up asking Wes Corbett, who was originally going to play on the session anyways, to produce it, which really, I'm really glad I did.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? If you've sort of assembled a bunch of stuff yourself, and like in many ways, it's easy to produce your own record, but there's just something that somebody, the right person, brings to the mix that can totally change what you do. And it also allows you, I guess, to step outside of, like, if you're producing and performing, you've sort of got to wear two hats all the time. Whereas if somebody else is producing, you can just play when you need to play.
Totally. It's definitely a hard gig to do both at the same time. And Wes was doing both at the same time the whole time. So I can just sort of pass that responsibility onto him. But yeah, you get outside of yourself. I, have worked for producers plenty as like a studio musician, but never on a creative project of my own. So it was a really um, enlightening and enriching experience to do that. When when it's somebody who you admire as a musician and you trust them. I basically said to Wes, like if you say I should do something, I'm gonna do it. Um, and again, I'm glad I did that because it made the record what it is. I think it would have been a significantly less cohesive collection of music if he hadn't helped me shape it into what it was going to be.
And it's really interesting. You sort of talking about putting that other record together and sort of patching things together yourself, but I read some of the stuff that came over with the record about wanting to sort of write for a band. I think it said you tried to write tunes to highlight everyone's unique voices on their instruments and arrange them for maximum opportunity for us all to interact deeply in real time. So it sounds like you'd got the band together before you finalized all the material.
Yeah, pretty much. I personally have a hard time writing music unless I have like a frame for it, like a project. I kind of need that to light the fire. A friend of mine, I was talking about this with another musician friend of mine the other day, and she said, what's your process? And I said, I book a recording session and then freak out until I have enough music. And that's kind of the long and the short of it. But my sort of reasoning for making records of my own is to play with people who I, maybe don't get other opportunities to play with in my day-to-day life as a musician, because my day-to-day life as a musician is very all over the place. I play lots of different kinds of music with lots of different people, and every day and every week is different, and I love that. So when it comes time to do something creative, I'm thinking a lot about, who are my friends in my community who I haven't seen for a while and who's playing I love and I just want to play with. And also, who do I admire? Who's playing do I like? Who I feel like, I feel like I could get something cool together with them. And I just want to be in the room to hear to know what it feels like to play with them. So it's very much almost like a selfish thing. And yeah, so I really want to get stuff together that really makes it all about the band. I don't really feel that I have I don't feel this need to like impose like my just guitar playing all over everything. The record's not really about my guitar playing, even though, it's got my name on it and I wrote the tunes and put the band together. It's really more about the ensemble. So I didn't want to play melodies on every tune. I want to hear Rob Ikes, play my tune. I want to hear Avery Marriott play my tune. I can make a guitar record at home,
Well, it's really interesting because, listening to the record, if I hadn't known it was your record and somebody'd said one of the guys in this band, it's their record, who do you think it is? It'd be quite hard to work it out because it's not like they're all showcases for the guitar, and often with a kind of an instrumental player who's put a record together, you can sort of work out whose record it is. But in this case, it just sounds like a band. You wouldn't know.
Thanks. That was exactly my goal. And, part of it, like I was saying, I just want to be in the mix of the band and kind of assemble my dream band and just know what it feels like to be in the mix with those guys. And also, a lot of my favorite instrumental records are very much about that. They're not necessarily the picker shows off his, picking prowess record. That's cool, and I learn a lot from listening to those records, and I do love listening to them. But the stuff that like really lights me on fire is the more band-oriented stuff.
And with that in mind, was Wes on board with the project before you put the band together? Like, did you do that bit of it together, or was that already kind of arranged when he came on?
It was sort of a hodgepodge. It was mostly the band from the session that didn't happen. There was going to be another dobro player. Well, it was going to be one day with originally it was going to be one day with Ethan Yojevitz, Thomas Castle, Avery Merritt, and myself, just a quartet. And then Wes and another dobro player were going to come on a second day. So it was going to be a mix of 4-piece and 6-piece stuff. And then when Wes came on, it ended up being pretty much all those same guys, plus Rob, and we were all there every day.
We'll be right back with you just after this. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins. If you're attending the NAMM show in January, stop by the Collings booth to say hello to the team, get hands-on with their selection of customised acoustics and electrics, and check out some exciting new prototypes they're working on for 2024. They'll also have a few of their world-class artists on hand demoing various instruments. And if you can't attend, don't forget to follow their Instagram and Facebook accounts throughout the show for photos, videos, and the latest news. Collings guitars are hand-built from the Sound Up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If one of your 2024 resolutions is to improve as a musician, Peghead Nation is the place to go. They have 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music. Courses cover bluegrass, old time, Irish music and swing, plus lessons dedicated to improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 a month, and you can add more for $10. Try any course free for a month with the promo code JAMALONG. Make 2024 a year of more music at pegheadnation.com. It's an interesting sort of mix. There's such a span of instrumental string band kind of recordings over the past few decades, from stuff that has the sort of the 5-piece traditional lineup through things that have some of it but not all of it, like Hawktail has no banjo, for example, and there's such a different palette. It's like even some of the Tony Rice stuff, Manzanita not having banjo on it, and it's really interesting that you went down the route in the end of basically having the bluegrass lineup, but playing these sort of they're not traditional bluegrass tunes, obviously. But I always find it fascinating hearing that the sort of the fixed lineup, for want of a better phrase, but playing new material.
Yeah, I find it creates a lot of cohesion across the music. I live in Los Angeles, and there are quite a few great string band musicians here, and they're more and more moving here all the time. But the bench isn't nearly as deep as it is in Nashville. So like part of it was just like, I just want to play with a really amazing banjo and dobro player, because I so rarely get to do that.
Yeah. And in terms of the tunes, I'm always fascinated with this kind of record, like to what extent the tunes are sort of composed versus, because at one end you get the sort of, essentially somebody's written a new fiddle tune that you play and then everybody improvises, and then the end of it is much more, some of Wes's stuff is like this, I guess, is much more composed and much more arranged and almost fully realised with parts, and then so much stuff is somewhere in between the two. Is there a sort of approach across the record? Does it vary by the tune on this one?
I think everything's a little bit different. Every song had, a melody and chord changes. But the forms were very much dictated by, like we were talking about before, wanting to really bring out the um, everybody's voices. Um, like a song like, Blue Moose, that's a 4-part tune. But if I just played A, B, C, D, the 4 parts one after the other, I don't think it would be nearly as compelling as the way um, we arranged it, where the parts kind of jump around a little bit and you go somewhere else for a while, then you come back to the thing you heard before, and then you keep going in this other, the parts are just, jumbled around a little bit more. And that's very much a function of, well, what of arrangement and orchestration, what voice do I want to hear after this? Where are we going to go next? So, but at the core of it, it is still a tune. But yeah.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does totally. And I think it's was talking about structure, that essentially the point of structure in music is to balance new stuff with familiar stuff, to give the listener some sort of sense of where they are. And with a fiddle tune with 3 or 4 parts, there's such a tendency to just go A, B, A, B, A, B, or A, B, C, A, B, C, A, B, C. And so to mix things around a bit, so you've still got that familiarity of something you've heard, but it's not necessarily as linear as, just doing all the parts, then doing them again. I think it can often be a really interesting way to experience material, because you do get that a sort of textural shift of, you don't always come out of one thing into the same thing.
Totally. One of my teachers and mentors growing up was a guitar player named Julian Lodge, and I would, take composition lessons with him, where in addition to guitar lessons, but like I would write a tune or song or piece of music and show it to him, and he would kind of help me massage it and say, well, you could do that there. Why don't you switch that around? And something he would talk about a lot was this idea of inevitability, this idea that every part of the song, just like it, just you want to write it so that it naturally, so that every place you go to feels like, oh, well, of course it had to go there. And that's something I think I've kind of thought about a lot. I went to music school. I guess you could say I'm formally trained, so to speak, but I like don't get really, I haven't gotten like so in the weeds of like formal classical composition, or even, jazz composition relative to a lot of people I know. There's still some kind of like boneheaded thing to it, but it's a kind of a mix between that and maybe a more I don't know what you would call it. Not, I don't want to say academic, but I can't deny the stuff I learned growing up and playing other kinds of music. But I also try not to get too heady about it.
Well, it's like, I remember in some ways the compositional side of it is no different from the technique on your instrument side of it, in that you accumulate whatever bag of tricks or approaches or ideas or practices you've got, and then the idea is that you sort of park them all at the door and see what comes out, and I find it really interesting because there is such a strong tradition of people learning acoustic string band instruments in a music college setting now that's been there for quite a while, but it's it can produce much more cerebral music, but it can also, one of the example I come back to is Hawktail. Like it's melody driven music, not clever. It's not there to be clever. It's there to, and this very much feels like the case with Passages, in that each piece is a tune first and foremost, and there's lots of interesting stuff going on, but it's not. It's pretty straightforward to listen to in terms of it's very melodic, and it's very there's not any kind of big jarring crunching shifts. There's interesting places where something might go you weren't expecting it to, but it feels like everything was composed to be a tune rather than an idea, if that makes sense.
Totally. Thank you. That is definitely something I I wanted to do. You know, um, it would be dishonest, I think, for me to make a record of just, you know, straight fiddle tunes. And it would also be dishonest to like make an extremely, you know, through composed, you know, 12 tone string band record. I mean, that would be cool. I hope somebody does that. But I think my sensibilities kind of lie kind of smack in the middle of that. Um, and I wonder what, you know, like I said, I studied music formally, but um, the acoustic music world was something that um, I didn't really study formally. I kind of discovered that while I was in school and kind of sought it out on my own. Um, Outside of that, like I went to a couple camps and things, but you know, I wasn't doing like the American Roots program at Berkeley or anything like that. Um, so, you know, but I wonder how, you know, this music would be different if I had had that experience sometimes. You know, you never really know. Um, but it's all cool. And, you know, so many musicians, you know, that I've played with and love have come out of that world.
Yeah, and there's all sorts of conversations you can have about, like, particularly with roots music, about growing up with it versus studying it versus growing up with it, then studying it versus, like, they're all approaches are valid and all have produced music that I love. And what was your kind of route into it all? Do you come from a kind of background where this music, sort of bluegrass string band music, was around, or is it something you came to sort of through being a musician?
I would say maybe more the latter. I, you know, grew up with folk music in the house, definitely. Um, so just the sound of a bunch of acoustic instruments playing together has always, you know, kind of been back there. But my upbringing was very much kind of classic. Um, you know, guitar player, you know, playing in rock bands. You know, I knew I always wanted to be a musician. Um, you know, for my career, my life, or whatever. And um, the obvious thing was, well, okay, if you want to do that, and you know, my parents said, okay, well, you got to go to college. You know, the only real options that I was aware of were classical and jazz. And classical guitar is one of those things where, you know, if you want to do it at a collegiate level, like you already got to be doing it for a while. And I was in high school at that point, so I was like, well, I guess you know, I'll do jazz. So I got real into that music in high school and college. Ended up going to USC um, for they have this program called Studio Guitar, um, which is very much all about, you know, being a well-rounded guitar player that is employable. You know, that can work and play a lot of different styles of music and read and know how to record. So that's sort of where Cliff Notes where I come from. But then I fell in love with the acoustic thing kind of a few different ways. I mentioned that one of my mentors growing up was Julian Lodge. He and I are from the same town in Northern California. And I met him when I was maybe 15. And around the time his first record came out. And that record, you know, it's got some jazz stuff, it's got some more through composed stuff, and there are these tracks with Bela Fleck and Chris Thile. And so I was like, well, this guy's doing everything, you know, I could possibly ever want to do. So I really made it a priority to spend as much time with him as I could. He was, you know, very generous towards me and taught me a lot. But around the time that I was in LA, he and Critter had been starting to play together. So I would go see them play at Largo, which is a venue here in LA. And, you know, just sort of hang out a little bit, like a little parasite after the show. So that and Sean and Sarah Watkins have had a show at Largo for 20 odd years at this point. So I think
Mm.
Julian and Critter came to do that. Um, and um, I saw them all play together, and I had been pretty burned out on um, academic music in an academic setting for the better part of a year at that point. Um, and I was like, man, like what? Just I wasn't really excited about music, and seeing all these people play together, one of whom, felt like, he was very much of more the world that I knew. I saw the connection, between those, acoustic string band music and jazz, improvised music, whatever you want to call it. These are, words are hard. Describing music is hard. I think of things more in terms. I'm thinking of these things more in terms of like communities of people than I am like
Mm.
sounds. But I was like, oh, like this acoustic bluegrass world is kind of like this jazz world, but the people are nicer and there are less chords. Um, and that was immediately appealing. Oh, and like you can like carry around your instrument everywhere. You don't need an amp. You don't need a
Mm.
drum kit. The music is very mobile. So the practical consideration of it too was very exciting. And everybody just looked like they were having so much fun. And I was like, man, I want to have that much fun. Um, so that was really the kicker. Um, and then, like I said, I was studying with Julian kind of on and off at that time. And he was super encouraging and said to me like, yeah, like you could really do this. This music is kind of well suited to you. And I didn't know anything about it. I was just trying to learn tunes and take in records and pick up as much as I could. And he was teaching at that time at every year at this camp in Savannah, Georgia, that the Savannah Music Festival puts on called the Acoustic Music Seminar. Mike Marshall directed it. And it was sort of like a week-long intensive workshop for sort of like youngish acoustic musicians, to sort of, study at the feet of the masters, so to speak, and, get their music together and, meet like-minded people. So he was teaching there, and he said, you should come to this thing that I teach at. And the cutoff, the age cutoff was 22. I was 2 months away from turning 23.
Mm.
It was right after I finished college. And so I went to that, and it was like basically an instant catapult into meeting all these people my age who were playing this music. And I was like, oh my God, these are my people. Um, and that's where I met Thomas. That's where I met Avery. And yeah, a lot of people. So that was kind of the big entree. And like I said, Julian was at that camp. Mike Marshall, Daryl Scott, Bryan Sutton, who ended up being big for me. He was teaching there as well. And all these people were just like so encouraging and welcoming. And it kind of just like felt like the home that I didn't know I had, that I found, way later than I ever expected.
Weirdly, I sort of feel the same about it. I've been doing this podcast for like 3 years now, and I'm from the UK. I don't come from a like roots musical bluegrass background at all, but one thing I've learned is if you show up and you want to contribute something and be there, you're in. Like there's no snobbishness. There's no kind of there doesn't seem to be any kind of implied hierarchy or competitiveness. It just appears to be, to me, like a world in which if you want to be in there, then you're welcome.
I think so. There's not, in the grand scheme of musicians in the world, there's not a lot of people doing it. So there's very much this like, well, the more the merrier, and everybody has something to contribute. I don't think I would have felt that way as an instrumentalist in the jazz world, because so much of that music is very much about like moving the music forward. And of course, we all want to move the music forward. That is part of what music is all about. But um, I I have yet to really find a zone as an electric guitar player, um, doing writing and playing my own music, where I feel like um, where I don't have like insecurities about contributing something. The acoustic music thing almost feels like um, just more like freeing, or just it just feels more possible to do something and learn and grow in this music while you're you know trying to make some stuff.
Yeah, and it's funny, isn't it? And you're sort of talking about, like, sort of the people are nicer and there are fewer chords, but there's something about like the string band music can be like stupendously intricate, and it can be very simple, and it can be all points in between, and it can be like Punch Brothers' Blind Leading the Blind, or it can be two people playing Whiskey Before Breakfast together. And there's some, and then you chuck a banjo into the mix, and there's just something about that. I don't know what it is, but there's something that is just it's something that takes what it does very seriously, but somehow manages not to take itself seriously at the same time, which isn't the perception people have of jazz musicians. And I'm not saying that's true, but pretty much everybody I've met in the world of string band music, or interviewed, or spoken to, or listened to an interview with, doesn't appear to take themselves that seriously, but they take what they do very seriously, and there's something beautiful about that.
Yeah, I think that's true of the greatest jazz musicians as well. I think most musicians, you kind of have to have a sense of humor to do this, because the whole concept of it is like kind of absurd when you when you think about it. But that was actually something that my one of my jazz guitar teachers in college, this brilliant uh, guitar player, Bruce Foreman, one of the things he would say a lot was, take the music seriously, but don't take yourself seriously. That was kind of one of his isms.
Yeah, and it's sort of okay. Maybe this is an interesting point to sort of talk about the book a bit as well, because we're sort of coming into some of the territory of that a little bit. These conversations about how to be a musician and how to approach stuff. And so the book's called String Theories: Tips, Challenges, and Reflections for the Lifelong Guitarist. I'd be interested just to hear, to start with, how the book came about, because it's a really interesting one, and we'll talk about a bit about what's in it in a minute. But I'd love to hear about sort of how it came to be in the first place.
Yeah, totally. Well, thank you, first of all. It was a total labor of love, and it really kind of starts with my co-author, Adam Levy. I don't know if you're familiar with Adam. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with Adam, but he is a brilliant guitar player and composer and singer-songwriter and teacher, and probably he's one of those guys who, even if you've never heard his name, you've definitely heard him play, because he played guitar in a couple recordings that a lot of people have heard. Give Me One Reason by Tracy Chapman, and Norah Jones's first three albums. So he's kind of really where it starts. He lives in New York now, but for most of the past, I guess, 10 years or so, he was living in LA, which is where I met him. And immediately he was one of those guys where I heard him play, and I was like, that's the thing. I went to all of his gigs. I took some guitar lessons with him. We became friends. And he had been doing this series of lesson videos, which he still does on YouTube, called Guitar Tips. And they were just kind of little bite-sized nuggets of, things that he had learned over his career. that he thought could be useful to other guitar players. Um, so the idea, well, we were talking one day, and he said, I just realized that I'm the same age as Mick Goodrick was when he published The Advancing Guitarist. Um, Mick Goodrick, jazz guitar education and player legend. And that book, The Advancing Guitarist, is kind of an essential book for budding jazz guitar players. So it was a book that we both appreciated and talked about a lot and learned from over the years. So he said, I'm as old as he was when he put that book out, and I said, I think it's time that you write your own version of it. And he said, why don't we write it together? And I took him up on that. That's basically how it happened. A lot of it was done during COVID, just because there was so much time, and I would, sit down and, it started with taking those. I mentioned that YouTube series he had done. It started with taking some of those lessons and transcribing them to text and sort of reformatting them for the page. Then, so originally it was going to be Guitar Tips, the book. So that's how it started. And then we added other material. He invited me to come up with some of my own stuff. He added some new things. I, sent him some prompts like, why don't you talk about, 10 lessons you learned from 10 recording sessions you did? So that's something that's in there. And so over time, it became this kind of big amorphous blob of material. So we wanted to figure out how to organize it. So what we ended up doing is separating it into 3 sections: tips, challenges, and reflections. Tips are the bite-sized pieces of information that you can kind of pick up and work on in one sitting. Challenges are sort of, longer term projects. Like, here's a bunch of ways to map the fretboard. Here's like approaches to, playing well, backing up a singer, things like that. And then reflections are kind of big picture things, thinking about how do you be a musician in the world? I guess that's the Cliff Notes. I really wanted to have something that I personally would want to keep on my music stand and refer back to as a reference for what is important to me. Because, it is very hard to keep a consistent practice going of anything, let alone music, and to kind of have some things to remember and think about to kind of set you straight if you get sidetracked by one thing or another is really helpful. So that's one thing I wanted out of it. And then the other thing was for it to be something that could kind of appeal to anybody at any point in their journey, whether, they're just beginning, or they're a hobbyist, or, they're a student, or they're already a working musician. I wanted it to feel accessible to, and I think Adam did too, to kind of really anybody at any point along their musical journey.
I think it's the kind of book that not only, if you got 50 guitarists at different points in their journey, each one of them would find something in it. But if you took one guitarist and revisited them at 50 points in their individual journey, they would find something in it, if that makes sense. That it's,
totally. I love that. That's awesome.
It's not so it's not a method book, but it's also not there are books like sort of Zen Guitar or things like In a Game of Music that are very much about the bringing yourself as a human being to the instrument, and there's definitely some of that in it. And I love those kinds of conversations. And you mentioned Bryan Sutton. Having had lessons with Bryan on Artist Works for 3 years, he's great at those kinds of conversations, and I love all that. But it feels a bit like a book you just like could use for inspiration, because I think that's one of the things people struggle with sometimes, is even if you've got an hour to practice every day, knowing what to practice and how to approach it, and how to, like, you could sit down and play for an hour a day for 365 days, but it doesn't mean you're practicing or you're doing anything constructive. Or so there's just so many, like, and it's the kind of book you just read till you find a thing that resonates, and then you go, right, I'm going to do that. And then you go back in and find another thing and go, I'm going to do that. And then there's some tips on how to structure all of that in terms of structuring a practice session. But I don't know if you had them when you were a kid, but we had these things called choose your own adventure books, where it'd be like, turn to page 33 if you want to take the left path. If you want to battle the monster, it's got a feel of that about it, and that you just take the bits that you want. And then if you read it again, you'll take some other bits, and a bit that totally passed you by now might totally resonate in 3 years, and you go, that's what I want to work on now. And so it feels like I've had a look through it for a week or two, and I don't feel like I'm anywhere near mining even understanding what's in there yet, which is really exciting.
Me neither. Like I it's all about the continuity of it. Music is this never-ending thing, right? You never quite get there. There is no there. You just keep going and seeing what happens. And I think that idea is very much kind of threaded through it.
And that's one of the things that sort of became clear to me doing these interviews over the course of 2 or 3 years, is interviewing people like Bryan Sutton or Sierra Hull, or like people that, from my point of view, I sort of think they've arrived. Like, it's easy to look at them and go, well, they're there, they've reached the destination. And none of them talk about themselves like that. They're all still... They're on, they're just a bit further down the road, but they're still like, well, what's next? Well, why can't I do this? Or like, what happens if I did that? Or, everybody is just moving forward.
Totally. You're absolutely right. I think it can be so easy to, like those moments of inspiration where you see somebody do a thing and you're like, that's it. That's the thing that I want to do. It can be easy to think of that as this destination point. But that was one solo in one song in one set at one gig, in one tour in 1 year, and they were gonna play another solo on the next song and at the next gig, and like, there's this continual progression that when you have that snapshot moment of inspiration, you don't necessarily have that context of the person's experience that inspired you. So then you go along and you're trying to chase that thing, and I think eventually you realize, like there is, like, it's actually about the chase. It's not about the thing.
Yeah, and there's one point there. I can't remember if it was one of yours or one of Adam's points. I think it might be one of yours. You said that you'd sort of had a bit of a moment with, I can't remember that. I should have written this down. A guitarist who sort of basically said to you that progress isn't linear. Like this idea that you sort of think, you'll reach, and it's, I can't remember what it was you said now, but it's just this idea that the moments you feel the progress aren't necessarily going to be like when you've put the work in. Stuff's just going to surface when you least expect it, and you will have a moment when you go, oh, I'm there. Yeah.
And then you go, what's next?
Yeah. And there's so many bits in here that, but one of the themes that, not a theme, but one of the points that really stands out for me is, and it has maybe made sense to me for the first time, because people have said this to me before, but keep a practice journal. And that's something that I've been told or I've read, and I've gone, okay, that intellectually makes sense, sort of. But it doesn't, just the way it is described in the book, I suddenly realised what the point of it was. That it's not just a list of things you've done. In the way that a personal journal isn't just like a diary, isn't a list of what happened to you that day. It's an opportunity to reflect on where you are and where you want to go and what you're finding difficult, and just to remind yourself, if you feel a certain way now, that maybe you didn't feel that way 30 days ago, or like it's a kind of almost like a little progress barometer in a way as well.
Absolutely. I think the accounting of what you have done is also great. And my personal practice journal, which is just, like a note in the Notes app on my phone, there's certainly a lot of that, just because it's very easy to forget what you did 3 days ago. And if you want to keep chipping away at this thing, you got to remember that you were chipping away at it in the first place. But yeah, you even, at the end of the year, to look back on what you were doing at the beginning of the year, or extrapolate that out over a period of multiple years. Like if I looked at, my practice journals from 5 years ago, it might be a bunch of the same stuff. But I may feel way differently about it, or I may be approaching it completely differently than I was, or it could be completely different stuff. It's just, it's always cool to look back and see your own growth, no matter what you're doing. I think it's really, it's exciting and it's powerful to appreciate how far you've come.
Yeah, and I think in all forms and areas of life, it's so easy to look at where you are and where you want to get to, and not look at how far you've come. And it's so easy just to go, but what about that? I can't do this, I can't do that, and look at our, the things we can't do, and not go. But there was a point where I couldn't even play the guitar.
Totally.
Look at me now.
Totally. If you had told me 15 years ago that I'm doing everything that I'm doing now, I'd be like, that's great, but you're crazy. That's just the nature of it.
Yeah, and it is just that. And I think that's one of the things that the book is really kind of good for, is also just reminding you that it's just about putting a bit of work in every day, and setting some sort of intent as to what it is you want to work on, and then doing it. And like the rest of it will come over the days and weeks and the months and the years. But it's an easy, I find that it's a really simple lesson to talk to my son about when he's playing the piano or the drums, or just life. Just go just put a bit of work in every day, and you'll find you get to the places you want to get to. But when I'm talking to myself about it, I'm like looking for all the shortcuts and all the quick wins and all the, all.
Aren't we all?
Yeah,
Aren't we all?
And I know they don't exist.
Yeah. It's tricky because, you want to feel like, it's just so hard to see that day-to-day progress, even when you are putting in the time. And I think the further along you get, the truer that becomes. So you kind of have to look at your progress over a longer period of time.
Yeah. And there's just so many, I think there's lots of ideas in here that, like, you talked about the tips, challenges, and reflections from different amounts of time or different sort of spans of focus. But some of the stuff that is just things you can do while you don't even have a guitar in your hand. Like, the idea of just listening and creating a playlist of the kind of things you want to be able to play, and immersing yourself in it, and thinking about timing and beat placement and, all the things. And when I've talked to people, I've done so many episodes now for the podcast, interviewing people about other people. I've interviewed loads of people about Tony Rice, loads of people about Clarence White, Earl Scruggs, and that ability to choose where you place yourself within the beat has come up as such, like timing as such a thing, and the choices people have, and how far forward you want to lean or how far back you want to lean, or, you know, whether you want to hit the beat smack on the head, and just things that I think so many people don't even think about. And then when they do, get to the point where you can internalize that and actually make some choices. And it's so interesting just reading those things. Like the example that's given is to listen to Chuck Berry's recording of Johnny Be Good. And like everybody, and I get the same feeling from Jailhouse Rock, and maybe it's like a sort of early rock and roll thing, because there weren't really rock musicians then. There were people who'd played some swing and some like jump band stuff and some blues, and they were all trying to find this sense of timing together, and they've all got a slightly different version of it. And so somebody's swinging a little bit and somebody else isn't, like totally sort of straight eighth notes, and you listen to it and anybody can hear that that's going on. But to understand how you might do that yourself is another thing. But once you've heard it and you know that exists, then it's always there.
Totally. I think it's just a matter of paying attention, you know. And you know, just to tie it back to the string band thing a little bit, I think, you know, growing up playing with drummers, there's this fallacy that the drummer's the timekeeper and everybody follows the drummer, and, you know, you don't need to have you don't need to worry about, you know, having a like yes, have good time, but like, you know, the drummer's going to lay down the time and everybody's going to follow him, so you don't have to worry about it too much. And with string band music, everybody is the drummer. And it's that rub, that gel that you're talking about with that early rock and roll stuff, you know, that kind of negotiation of the time between all the people in the band is what makes, you know, great string band music great. And it is so amazing to watch somebody just be like, right here, this is where the time is, who's not a drummer. And that, you know, that was part of the attraction of the music for me. Like, oh man, if I can like really play this stuff, like maybe I'll finally get my time together. I remember, you know, in my early 20s going to see one of those Watkins Family Hour shows, and there was a point during some song where the time was just, you know, feeling like a little squirrely. They hadn't, you know, just the band hadn't quite settled on where it was, and Sarah Watkins just stomped her foot down, smack on the beat, and I was like, oh my, like it just that one foot on the ground just absolutely blew my mind. And I was like, that confidence, that's what I want. You know, that's the shit.
I remember years ago going to see Living Colour play live, and like their, you know, sort of their ability to stretch, like some of the stuff on the record, they keep it fairly straight, but like live, sometimes you can hear every member of the band is syncopating against something that nobody's actually playing at any given time, and you're like, you know that there's a beat in there somewhere, and they all know exactly where it is, and then they all land on it. And you go, oh, it's there, and it's crazy.
It's like a magic trick.
Yeah. And they all know exactly what it is they're dragging against or rushing ahead of or whatever, and then they all just got to bring it into land, and you know, it's an amazing thing. And there's so many bits in there. Just, you know, just such a simple. There's one, I think, one heading that just says "practice making real music," and it's like such a simple, like the idea that you can play as many technical exercises. I mean, I remember hearing an interview with Chris Thiele years ago. He said, I don't really like practicing scales. There's so many good fiddle tunes that are basically scales. Just play those. Or there's so much Bach that it's great. It's made of scales. Why don't you play? And obviously, he's practices scales. You hear him play, he's definitely practiced some scales. But it's such a simple thing, is to like practice music, because that's what you're going to be playing. And so obviously technical work is important, but it's always in the service of, you know, the final end goal is to make music. And it's such
Totally.
I could revisit those 4 words every year for the next 10 years and, just have a little moment of, yeah, of course,
Yeah, it can be so easy to think, all right, like I gotta work through this book, and then I can get to these tunes. But, you know, it all comes down to like what do you want to do? And I think asking ourselves that question and having a real clear answer for it, very much will guide us. Because if you don't know what you want to do, then having a book of scales and patterns to, you know, like that'll keep you busy for the rest of your life. But it won't necessarily give you the tools to play music with other people unless that's something you're really thinking about doing.
Yeah.
And not everybody wants to play music with other people. But if you do, playing real music, that's the way to do it.
Yeah, and I sort of started out as a drummer sort of years and years and years ago. And it's the point that you start making music with other people, you realize how little music you have to play to enjoy it. Like as a drummer particularly, once you can play like a basic beat, you can make hours of music with people without needing to do much more. But when you're sat on your own in your room, you want to play loads of stuff because playing a beat on your own is really boring. And just that thing of when you start playing with other people, you realize how little there's a really interesting exercise in the book that just says, play one thing for as long as you can get away with and see how long you can get away with it. And I remember having that sort of epiphany years ago in a band I was in college and just I wonder how long in this song I can get away with just playing an E note. So I'm going to do it. And so we ended up with a song where all I play for a whole verse is an E note. There are 6 chords in this verse, but I just play this E note all the way through, which ends up being the root, the 5th, the 3rd, the 7th, the 2nd, the 4th, whatever of these individual chords. And then eventually it resolves. And it's just wonder what happens if I do this. And there are so many lovely little sort of ideas and challenges around that in the book of just, it's like a thought. What if this? How does this apply to you? Where's that going to take you? Go and think about that for a bit. And it just feels like such a deep well of, like wisdom sounds like you're handing down all the things you know, and it's not even that. It's just it's inspiration, I guess, more than anything. It feels like, and that's sometimes the thing that is hardest to find.
Totally, and I certainly don't know everything. I haven't been doing this that long in the grand scheme of things, and I would very much not feel comfortable being like, I am the oracle. That's not even really my temperament at all. But I also I wanted to. I'm looking over here because the book is on my music stand right now. I wanted. I wanted to make something that I wish somebody had given to me when I was 15. That was very much, the guiding light. And, it also, so much of this comes from Adam. He's, been playing music for a living since I was in diapers. So like, yeah, like I've done some gigs and made some records and learned some stuff. But he's done even more. And there's a weight to that experience, that real life boots on the ground stuff that that you can't really get anywhere else. So a lot of it just comes from him.
And I think that sort of ties in a little bit with what we were talking about before about taking the music seriously but not taking yourself seriously, and that there is a real weight to what's in this book, but it doesn't. This is going to sound like a really stretched metaphor, maybe, but it doesn't feel like a weight to. It doesn't feel like a weight to receive it. It's like it feels like here's a bunch of stuff. Take what you need, rather than here's the stone tablet. Here's a bunch of stuff. Take what you need and come back when you need some more.
Thanks. I appreciate that. I am, I'm easily overwhelmed by that kind of material. Um, like if say you want to learn some tunes and somebody hands you a list of 500 tunes, you're like, all right, well, what do I do with this? As opposed to saying, okay, learn this tune, start there, and then let's play it, next week.
Yeah. And it feels like, I think that maybe what I was grasping for was it feels like a book full of things you could do, not a book full of things you should do.
I love that. Can we use that in our marketing copy?
You absolutely can. But it's just like that's what I loved about it, was it just felt like here's a bunch of possible stuff. Not here's a, set of instructions. If you don't get to the end of them, it's your fault.
Yeah, I don't think anybody likes being talked down to. And music is supposed to be fun. It's not supposed to feel like a slog. I think anybody who really commits to making music their life, whether professionally or not, it can be very easy to get into that mindset and just feel like a grind and forget about the fun of it. And maybe, what brought you into loving it in the first place. And whenever you can be like doing hard work to acquire new skills and still feel that way, I think that's like whenever it's possible to access that combination of things. I think whenever we can, we might as well.
And that kind of puts me in mind of the record as well, Passages, in that clearly a lot of thought and work has gone into it, but it's also an incredibly accessible listen.
Thanks.
And like it has the depth. You can go back and listen to it many times and hear different things in it, but it's not forcing you to work to get something out of it immediately. And I really enjoyed it. I hope it does really well for you, and I hope the book does really well. And it's been really cool chatting to you about both of them.
Thanks so much, Matt. This was really, really fun.
Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.